The most charming person in the room, the one who remembered your coffee order, who made you feel like the only person at the party, who moved the relationship forward faster than you could catch your breath, might also be the one you should be most afraid of. Today, we're getting into something that genuinely matters: how to recognize dangerous behavioral patterns in real people before they cause real harm. By the end of this episode, you'll know the difference between psychopathy and sociopathy, you'll understand the specific red flags that show up in relationships, and you'll have a clearer sense of what to actually do when something feels off. My guest today knows this territory deeply, so let's not waste any time. Walk me into this.
So the first thing worth saying is that when most people hear psychopath, they picture someone like Hannibal Lecter or, Dexter Morgan, this dramatic, obviously dangerous figure. And that image is almost exactly wrong when it comes to real life.
Wait, wrong how?
According to Psychology Today, people with high psychopathic traits are often extremely socially skilled, charming, and outwardly successful. Most of them are what researchers call subclinical, meaning they're under the radar, they're not criminal in the traditional sense, and they're never diagnosed. They blend in completely.
So the danger isn't the person who looks dangerous, it's the person who looks perfectly fine.
Exactly. And that's what makes this so hard to talk about and so important to understand. The harm tends to show up not in dramatic moments, but in a slow erosion. What Psychology Today describes as high conflict patterns that inevitably escalate relational conflict and cause trauma and emotional harm over time.
Okay, so let's use Dexter as a way in here, because I think a lot of people have a relationship with that character. He's charming, he's functional, he has a job, he has a family. Psychologists have actually weighed in on how accurate that portrayal is, right?
They have, and it's genuinely interesting. According to an analysis from Mind Psychiatrist, Dexter does exhibit several traits associated with psychopathy: emotional detachment, superficial charm, manipulative behavior, a lack of remorse. But psychologists also point out that his internal struggles and his adherence to a moral code, what the show calls Harry's Code, complicate the picture.
Right, because real psychopathy doesn't usually come with a moral code that conveniently targets only bad guys.
Exactly. And there's a psychological analysis from Simply Put Psych that goes even deeper. They argue Dexter is better understood as someone shaped by extreme childhood trauma. He witnessed his mother's murder at age 2 and sat in her blood for 2 days. That kind of primal trauma creates what the show calls the dark passenger, which analysts describe as a dissociative identity driving his compulsions.
That's a really different framing than just he's a psychopath.
It is. And it matters because in real life, the line between someone who is genuinely psychopathic and someone who is deeply traumatized and coping in destructive ways is not always obvious. That distinction changes everything about how you respond.
So let's get into the actual clinical picture. What are we actually talking about when we say psychopathy versus sociopathy? Because people use those words interchangeably, and I'm not sure they mean the same thing.
Great question. And the short answer is they're related but distinct. Neither psychopath nor sociopath is a formal clinical diagnosis on its own. Both fall under what the DSM-5 calls antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD, but the way they show up in behavior is different.
How so?
According to research compiled across several sources, including ourmental.health and Mind Psychiatrist, sociopaths tend to be more impulsive and erratic. They may form shallow emotional connections, act more spontaneously, and display obvious aggression. Psychopaths, on the other hand, tend to be more calculated and emotionally cold. They typically lack emotional attachments entirely, plan their actions meticulously, and maintain a convincing facade of normalcy.
So the sociopath is more likely to blow up at a dinner party, and the psychopath is more likely to smile through it and then quietly make your life miserable later. That's a pretty accurate way to put it. And the research also suggests their origins differ. Sociopathy is thought to be more influenced by environmental factors, while psychopathy may have a stronger genetic component, though both involve persistent antisocial behavior, impaired empathy, and a lack of remorse. And the Cleveland Clinic actually weighed in on this too, right? They had a psychologist speak to what ASPD really looks like day to day.
Yeah, Dr. Ramon Ford from the Cleveland Clinic made a point I think is really worth sitting with. He said, and I'm quoting here, "Someone who's living with ASPD has a hard time developing empathy for other people. As a result, they may have a hard time trusting others and sometimes fall into an isolated pattern of thinking." And he also noted that people living with ASPD often engage in consistent and repetitive abusive behaviors like gaslighting, manipulation, and deceit, often without even knowing it or acknowledging it.
That without even knowing it part is kind of chilling, actually.
It is. And it connects to something NeuroLaunch points out, that manipulation in the context of these personality disorders is often not a deliberate, calculated choice. It's a maladaptive coping strategy. There's usually a nervous system in survival mode behind the behavior.
Okay, I want to push on that a little because I think that framing can sometimes be used to excuse genuinely harmful behavior. Like, at what point does they can't help it stop being a reason and start being a rationalization?
That's the right question to ask. And Neurolaunch actually addresses it directly. They say that setting firm, consistent boundaries is not cruelty. It's often what allows real change to happen for both the person doing the manipulating and the people around them. Understanding the root cause doesn't mean tolerating the harm.
That's a really important line. Okay, so let's get into the actual red flags, because I think that's what people really need, not just the clinical definitions, but the specific things to watch for.
Right. So let's start with what Psychology Today calls the most deceptive one, which is charm that rapidly escalates intimacy, but not trust. At the start of the relationship, this person comes across as charismatic, attentive, intensely engaging. Commitment moves quickly, but emotional intimacy lags way behind.
So it feels serious, but it doesn't feel safe.
Exactly that. Psychology Today describes it as vulnerability being one-sided. You share your thoughts, your feelings, your personal experiences, and you receive little or no emotional reciprocity in return. Research cited there from Hare in 2003 suggests that individuals high in psychopathy display superficial charm paired with what's called shallow affect. The warmth is real enough to draw you in, but there's no emotional depth underneath it.
And that's what people sometimes call love bombing, right? That intense early attention that feels amazing, but is actually a red flag.
Love bombing is one of the tactics, yes. Mind Psychiatrist lists it alongside gaslighting as one of the key manipulation tactics used in these relationships, both designed to destabilize your perception and foster dependency. Love bombing pulls you in fast, and then gaslighting keeps you doubting your own read on the situation.
And gaslighting is, for anyone who hasn't heard the term, when someone makes you question your own perception, memory, or sanity. WebMD describes it as a tactic that breaks down your trust in yourself.
That's right. And WebMD also points out something that I think is underappreciated. Manipulators are often very good at reading emotions. They use that skill not to connect with you, but to identify your weaknesses and take advantage of them. So the same emotional intelligence that makes them seem so attuned to you early on is actually being weaponized.
That's a really unsettling reframe. What's the next red flag?
Emotional reactions that don't match the situation. Psychology Today describes this as a person who remains eerily calm during moments of your distress, or becomes irritated when empathy would be expected, and then flips, reacting with disproportionate anger to what feels like a minor slight.
So you're never quite sure what version of them you're going to get.
Right, and there's actual neuroscience behind this. Research cited by Psychology Today from Blair in 2005 links psychopathy to reduced responsiveness to others' emotional cues, specifically fear and sadness. So when you're upset, their brain literally isn't registering it the way a neurotypical person's would. The result, as Psychology Today puts it, is that partners feel unseen while simultaneously walking on eggshells.
Unseen and walking on eggshells. That's such a precise description of what that dynamic feels like from the inside.
And it compounds over time. Mind Psychiatrist notes that relationships with people who have psychopathic traits can lead to increased anxiety, emotional exhaustion, depression symptoms, and long-term trust issues. The harm isn't just in the moment, it accumulates.
What about isolation? Because I feel like that's something that comes up a lot when people talk about these kinds of relationships.
It's a major one. Mind Psychiatrist lists efforts to isolate you as a key red flag, cutting you off from your support network, your friends, your family. And it often happens gradually, so you don't notice it until you look up one day and realize you've drifted from everyone who knew you before this relationship.
And by then, you're more dependent on them, which is exactly what they want.
That's the mechanism. It's control through dependency. And it connects to something the Cleveland Clinic flags as a sign of ASPD, attempting to gain power and control through aggression. That aggression doesn't have to be physical. It can be emotional, social, financial.
Okay, I want to bring in something that I think complicates this conversation in a useful way, because we've been talking about psychopathy and ASPD, but Neurolaunch points out that manipulative behavior also shows up in borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and histrionic personality disorder. So how do you tell the difference?
That's such an important nuance. And Neurolaunch is really clear on this. The same behavior can stem from completely different psychological engines. In borderline personality disorder, for example, manipulation tends to grow out of an intense fear of abandonment combined with difficulty regulating emotion. That's very different from the calculated, cold control you see in psychopathy.
So the behavior might look similar on the surface, but the motivation underneath is completely different.
Exactly. And Neurolaunch makes the point that understanding that difference matters for how you respond. Someone acting from a place of terror about being abandoned needs a different kind of boundary setting than someone who is deliberately and coldly calculating how to exploit you.
That's actually a really compassionate framing without letting anyone off the hook.
That's the goal. And I think it's worth saying, none of this is about diagnosing your partner. You're not a clinician. What you're doing is observing patterns over time. Mind Psychiatrist is explicit about this. Sociopathy and psychopathy are not diagnosed from single interactions. Long-term patterns and consistent behaviors provide a clearer understanding.
So it's not about one bad night or one weird reaction. It's about what keeps happening.
Exactly. And that's actually one of the things that makes these situations so hard to leave, because individually each incident can be explained away. It's the pattern that tells the real story.
Let's talk about the manipulation tactics more specifically, because I think people need concrete language for what they might be experiencing. You mentioned gaslighting and love bombing. What else?
WebMD has a really useful breakdown. Manipulators will often try to make you feel guilty. They skew situations to present themselves as the victim, or they remind you of times they've helped you so it feels like you owe them. They'll make you doubt yourself through repeated messages that you can't do something or don't understand. They'll compare you to others to make you feel less than.
And that line, "Why are you so sensitive? It was only a joke." WebMD actually calls that out specifically as something manipulators say.
Yes, and it's so effective because it turns your legitimate reaction into the problem. Suddenly you're defending your feelings instead of addressing what was said or done. That's the move.
And there's also the playing the victim angle, right? Where they flip the script entirely.
That's one of the most consistent tactics across the sources. The Rev Systems Guide on Spotting Manipulative People describes it as a way to deflect responsibility and manipulate emotions to gain advantage in conflicts. They portray themselves as the wronged party, which evokes your sympathy and shifts the focus completely off what they actually did.
And if you're a naturally empathetic person, you're especially vulnerable to that move.
Completely. WebMD makes the point that manipulators are skilled at reading emotions. They identify your empathy as a lever and use it. So the very quality that makes you a good person becomes the thing that's used against you.
Okay, I want to go back to Dexter for a second, because there's something about how we consume that character that I think is worth naming. We root for him, we find him compelling, and I wonder if that's actually doing something to how we recognize these traits in real life.
That's a really sharp observation. The Mind Psychiatrist analysis notes that Dexter's portrayal elicits mixed responses. Viewers grapple with their feelings toward his vigilante justice. And the Simply Put psychanalysis describes him as a pseudo-psychopathic character, meaning he has the traits but also the internal moral struggle that real psychopaths typically don't have.
So the show gives him just enough conscience to make him rootable, but real people with these traits don't come with that built-in moral break.
Right. And that gap between the fictional version and the real version is actually dangerous because it can make the real thing seem more romantic or more redeemable than it is. The charm is real, the depth is not.
That's a really important distinction. Okay, so let's say someone is listening to this and they're recognizing some of these patterns in a relationship they're in right now. What do they actually do?
The first thing is to trust your instincts. Mind Psychiatrist is really direct about this. If something feels off or triggers discomfort, your intuition may be signaling a deeper issue. Paying attention to those feelings can help protect you from harmful interactions.
Which sounds simple, but is actually really hard when you're in the middle of it.
It is, because part of what these dynamics do is erode your trust in your own perception. That's what gaslighting is designed to do. So rebuilding that trust in yourself is actually a significant part of the work.
And then what? Beyond trusting your gut.
Observe patterns over time rather than reacting to individual incidents. Set firm, consistent boundaries. Neurolaunch is clear that this is not cruelty. It's often what creates the conditions for anything to change. And if you suspect something serious, Mind Psychiatrist recommends consulting mental health professionals for evaluations and structured assessments.
So you're not trying to diagnose your partner. You're trying to protect yourself and get professional eyes on the situation.
Exactly. And Psychology Today makes a point that I think is worth ending on from a clinical perspective. Knowing the signs can help you remove yourself from a relationship before you are harmed. The goal of all of this awareness is not to become paranoid. It's to give yourself the information you need to make clear-eyed decisions.
Clear-eyed decisions. I like that framing. because I think one of the things these dynamics do is make everything feel foggy and confusing, and information is literally the antidote to that fog.
That's exactly right. And the Cleveland Clinic's Dr. Ford makes a point that I think reframes the whole conversation. He says people with ASPD often engage in these behaviors without even knowing it or acknowledging it. So you're not necessarily dealing with a cartoon villain who knows exactly what they're doing. You're dealing with someone whose capacity for empathy is genuinely impaired. That doesn't make the harm less real, but it does mean that waiting for them to suddenly get it is often not a realistic strategy.
Waiting for them to get it. That's the trap so many people fall into.
Because the charm is real enough that you keep believing the good version is the true version. But according to Psychology Today, that charm masks an inherent lack of emotional depth. The charming version isn't hiding the real person, it is the real person, and the depth you're hoping for simply isn't there.
So when you step back from everything we've covered today, here's what this really comes down to. The most dangerous behavioral patterns are not the ones that look dangerous. They're the ones that look like the relationship you always wanted.
That's the core of it. The charm, the intensity, the way they make you feel seen early on, those are features of the pattern, not evidence against it. And the research is consistent. The signs are there, they're learnable, and recognizing them early is the single most protective thing you can do.
And it's worth naming that this isn't about becoming suspicious of everyone you date. It's about knowing what a healthy relationship actually feels like. Emotional reciprocity, consistent behavior, genuine empathy, so that when those things are missing, you notice.
Perfectly put. The goal is not fear, the goal is clarity. And clarity starts with knowing what you're looking for.
We started this episode talking about the most charming person in the room. Here's what you now know. Charm that escalates intimacy without building trust. Emotional reactions that don't match the situation. Gaslighting that makes you doubt your own perception. Isolation from your support network, and a pattern of playing the victim to deflect accountability. Those are not quirks. Those are signals. And the fact that you can name them now means you're already harder to fool. And if any of this resonated in a way that felt personal, trust that feeling. Your instincts are data. Use them. Dexter Morgan had a code. Real life doesn't come with one, but now you do.